Hey everybody, my name's Travis. I'm an American expat living in Singapore. On this channel, we compare life in America to life in Singapore, and today we're talking about biking in Singapore. So as you may have heard me say on other videos on this channel, I bike almost every single day. I bike to lunch to go to the local hawker centers. I bike to the shopping malls. I bike everywhere that I go, unless it's someplace that's kind of far, then I'll take the MRT or the bus. So I'm on a bike a lot. And something that's true of Singapore, and just something that's true of Asia in general, is that biking is much more common here than it is in America. It's not that you don't see bikes in America, especially if you go to a major city. It's just that people bike for far more things here. You will see people who put, baskets on the back of their bike, and they're carrying everything from groceries to children to puppies to tools. They're just carrying a lot more things than you might see in the United States. I think in the United States we treat bikes very much like recreation, right? We use them on the weekends to have fun. We might use them to go to work, especially if we're in a place where that's possible for us to do. That's not always possible in America. But you see it here much more often. Because Singapore is so small, bikes become a really good option to get around town. Now, if you can get past the heat and you can get past the rain, that is. But most of the time in Singapore, it's pretty sunny, and we're lucky enough to have a lot of covered walkways here in Singapore. So even if it is raining, or even if it's a little bit hot, you're gonna be able to find some shade, and you're gonna be able to escape that rain in some of these walkways. Now, my bike is nothing special. I bought it at a local hawker market. It was new when I bought it, but it's not a name brand bike. And I would encourage, if you move to Singapore, if you come here for a little while and you want a bike, that's a great option. I got mine for $200, again, brand new. I thought that was a pretty good deal. But if you want something just quick and easy, if you don't want to sort of seek out a hawker market or a local bike shop, I would just go to Decathlon. As I've said in another video, which I'll post here, Decathlon is going to have everything you might need for the casual sports person, right? So they're going to have bikes and running gear and workout gear and stuff like that. And they have, probably, 12 to 15 varieties of bike that you can choose from. Everything from mountain bikes to road bikes to folding bikes, which I want to talk more about here in a second. But again, if you need something serious, if you're a serious athlete who needs a serious road bike or mountain bike, you're not going to want to go to a hawker market or to Decathlon. You're going to want to search out some of the more established bike shops here in Singapore. And luckily, there are quite a few. But if your purpose for buying a bike is just to get around town, then I really would recommend purchasing a folding bike instead of a traditional bike that you might find in America. In America, folding bikes, we certainly have them, but they're very rare. You could go to a Walmart or a Target or even an expensive bike shop, and you would only find traditional framed bicycles that don't fold. And I think that's just the nature that most Americans don't have to take their bikes on public transportation. But in Singapore, folding bikes are the only bike that is allowed to go on the MRT. So if you would like to hop the train and go to a stop across town and do some biking on the other side of town, you will not be able to do that unless you have a folding bike. I didn't know this rule when I purchased my bike because I purchased it the very first week that I lived in Singapore. But had I known about this rule, I would have purchased a folding bike and not a traditional bike. Since learning this, I have bought both my son and my wife folding bikes, and they can take theirs in the metro whenever they want to go out. And I may eventually trade mine in for a folding bike as well. And for getting around town, there really are no disadvantages to having a folding bike. You can change the seat out if it's not comfortable. You can find really lightweight versions of it. You can find fully adjustable versions that allow you to sort of move the handlebars and to move the different components around. So, it's a great option if you want the most versatile bike in Singapore. But if you've ever been to Asia in general, you'll know that biking is not always for the faint of heart. There's very few dedicated bike lanes in most of Asia, and Singapore is no different than that. So your options are going to be riding on the sidewalk with the pedestrians, of which there are many. You can ride in the street, for which there is lots of traffic and it's dangerous. Or you can bike on established trails, which go throughout the city, which is great. And we'll sort of talk about the advantages and disadvantages of each one. So riding on the sidewalk is by far the most common way to ride a bike in Singapore. According to the local laws, you don't have to wear a helmet unless you are in the street. So a lot of local Singaporeans, are not carrying around a helmet with them. They just ride on the sidewalk. And just like being pedestrian, you can get anywhere the sidewalks go. So it's a great way to get around town. I will say that the downside is you're sharing that space with pedestrians. One big difference between riding a bike in Singapore and riding one in America is just congestion. So when I was riding a bike in America, I come from the Northern Virginia, DC area, we would ride on the sidewalks, and I might be sharing the sidewalk with 5 to 10 people. But in Singapore, I'm going to be sharing the sidewalk with 10, 20, 50 people, and that can just cause a lot more congestion, and it can really, it can make the experience much more stressful. The culture in Singapore is to have a bell on your bike, and what's supposed to happen is as you approach a pedestrian, you're supposed to ring that bell, and then in theory, that pedestrian is supposed to move to the side. And in my experience, that happens about 50% of the time. Sometimes you'll have people that just don't hear you. It's quite loud. There's a lot of traffic in certain areas of the city, and so they just didn't hear you, or perhaps they're elderly and they have some hearing problems and they just didn't hear you. So there could be any number of reasons that they don't move right away, but that means you're going to have to hit your brakes, and you're going to have a lot of stop and go on the sidewalk. Another thing that can be a little bit annoying about riding on the sidewalk is that there's no standardized practice of which side of the sidewalk you're supposed to walk on or bike on. There's no passing side. Right, so in America, it's pretty normal for us to pass on the left, right? That's the passing side. And so if, I heard a bell coming behind me and they wanted to pass, my instinct would be to move to the right. But that doesn't seem to be the case in Singapore. And I think this is also true of most of Asia when I've traveled to other countries, that there's just no established traffic patterns on the sidewalk. So some people will walk on the left, some people will walk on the right, and bikes are just kind of weaving in between them. Sometimes bikes will ride on the left or the right. So there's no established culture of, you pass on the left or you pass on the right, and pedestrians should stay to one side or the other. And so it can create a much more chaotic, riding experience, especially if you're in a hurry and you're trying to get somewhere. Sometimes it can be quite slow and a lot of stopping and going. Now, if you're coming from America and you're not used to spending time in countries that drive on the other side of the street, I would not recommend riding your bike in the street. And that's just because I wasn't used to the patterns when I first got here. I'm still not really used to them. Chances are you're not going to be used to them, and so it's really not a good idea to put yourself in that traffic when you really don't know the patterns. The culture here, as it is in many Asian countries, is for scooters and bikes to lane split. So, when the cars are parked at a stoplight, for example, scooters and bikes just go right to the front. This is also true, when there's a bus lane on the left, so the bus might be over picking people up, and the bike will go on the right side of the bus, so they're between the bus and the traffic. So that lane right there can be quite dangerous, and we don't know when the bus is going to come out. A cab could be dropping somebody off. Any number of things could be happening. So if you're not a very competent bicyclist and you don't really feel comfortable with the traffic patterns, I would just stay out of the street. But if you do go in the street for any amount of time, know that the law is that you have to wear a helmet, and you do see people complying with that law. You see a lot of road bikers here. It's a very popular sport, and so they're always wearing helmets, and they're always out in the streets. Compared to other places, though, I think the drivers here are actually quite good. I know that many Singaporeans will disagree with me on that point, but compared to places like, Peru or, India or places like that, the driving here is actually quite organized. There are stoplights that people obey, and there's speed limits that for the most part people adhere to, or at least they move at the same speed. So, compared to America, Singaporean drivers, I think, are very comparable. So if you're used to riding in the street in America, you might be fine in the street in Singapore, so long as you really do have those traffic patterns solid in your head. But the third option, and my favorite, is the series of trails that they have all throughout the city. The first place to look for these trails is going to be along the canals in Singapore. Obviously, there's a monsoon season here. It rains quite a bit certain parts of the year. And so they have these very deep canals to help with drainage. And it actually does a great job. But along these canals, you will find bike trails usually on either side of that canal. And these are great for a couple of reasons. First is they're wider than a sidewalk, probably 3 to 4 times wider than a sidewalk. So you're just gonna have much more space to ride, right? So even if there's an equal number of pedestrians, those pedestrians are spread out over a larger surface area, and so it's gonna be a much more pleasant experience. The second big advantage is these trails are by far the safest. So you're not gonna have any chance of running into an uncle or an auntie. You're not gonna have any, cars pulling out in front of you. You're not really gonna have any of those kind of dangers that might be, out in the general population, right? If you're in the street, you might have to encounter a car or a bus or something. If you're on the sidewalk, someone might not hear your bell and you're gonna have to hit your brakes. It just doesn't happen on these trails. And so they're really safe. It's the place that I go and bike that I really enjoy, because it's just, the stress level is much lower, and it tends to be much more relaxing to be out on these trails than it does anywhere else. You can actually cover quite a bit of ground. These tend to be main arteries throughout the city. So if you need to get, 4 neighborhoods over, so long as, there's a canal that goes towards that neighborhood, you can get there much, much faster than taking a sidewalk or even taking the street, because you don't have any stoplights and you're not fighting the traffic along the way. So I would really, really encourage you to check out these trails. There are a couple of big ones that I would point you to first. The first one is called the Greenway. The Greenway runs north-south, and it's going to go all the way past Bukit which is going to be, it's the highest point in Singapore, but it's not really a mountain. It's Singapore. So it goes up to past Bukit and then it also goes all the way down to Tiong Bahru. And Tiong Bahru is a wonderful neighborhood with good restaurants and great stuff in it. So I would point you to that one first. It's a great trail. There are other great trails down at East Coast Park and West Coast Park. And these are both places where you would be able to rent bikes for the day. So if you don't want to buy a bike right away, or if you're, you're not sure if you want to own a bike yet, this would be a great place to go rent a bike, see the park, and some of those trails go for a long, long way. I know the one at East Coast Park runs the entire coast, I think all the way to the airport. That's a great place to go if you just want to try a bike, or if you want to see if your biking skills, are up to snuff here in Singapore. Also at East Coast Park, there's a wonderful hawker center right there. So if you end up renting a bike in East Coast Park, definitely check that place out. With all that said, I would highly recommend getting a bike if you move to Singapore. It's a great way to get around. I would say that if you don't feel very competent on a bike, that I would stick to the paved trails, or maybe even the sidewalks, depending on where you live. If you live in a place that's not quite as congested, it can really be a great way to get around. But if you're a very competent biker and you don't mind the kind of frustrations of the streets or the sidewalk, it really is going to be, in my opinion, the best way to get around. Well, that's it. Please let me know if you have any questions down in the comments. And bike safely, everybody. If you like this content, feel free to like and subscribe.